right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of Through the Labyrinth of the Mind, an anthology from Cloudscape Comics, looking at various stories of people dealing with different mental health issues. I think comics are a difficult thing to do a dramatic reading of, and so that combined with the fact that actually it's an anthology, and two of the people here were editors on the book, has inspired us to do something a little different, where we're going to be sort of talking about the genesis of the book, why we felt that it was important. Everybody here also contributed a story, so we'll be kind of discussing the development of that and why we felt that mental health was a significant and appropriate theme for a comic book anthology. And then at the end, we'll open it up to questions and discussion. So starting with myself, my name is Bevan Thomas. I was the creator and co-editor of Through the Labyrinth of the Mind. I'm a frequent writer and editor for Cloudscape Comics. I've written for a wide range of the anthologies. I've edited many of them, either as the main editor or just as part of a board of editors. Most prominently was Through the Labyrinth of the Mind, the anthology we'll be talking about, as well as Epic Canadiana, which was a series of anthologies that paid tribute to Canadian superheroes, especially the ones from 1940s comics. Both of those books are available on the bookstore just right across the hall, whereas other Cloudscape books are on the Cloudscape booth, which is sort of in the ice rink kind of main area upstairs. And a lot of my stuff that I've written has been sort of science fiction, fantasy, various horror, various supernatural stories, though I've also contributed to a wide variety of different genres. And I think more and more the last few years I've become especially interested in dealing with themes of mental health issues and exploring them and using sort of fantasy and supernatural imagery to try to capture their ineffable emotional experience for an audience. And that was a big inspiration for Through the Labyrinth of the Mind. So maybe how about actually I'll start with my co-editor. So Hannah, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Hannah Myers, and I was a co-editor on the project Through the Labyrinths of the Mind. I also served on the board for Cloudscape. I started as secretary and then became vice president, and eventually I was hired to be the editor-in-chief there. And so I worked, my first main project was The Witching Hours through Cloudscape, and then this was my next sort of major anthology project. And I currently work as a comic artist and illustrator out of City Center Artist Motel in Vancouver. And we have Alina.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alina Pete. I'm an Indigenous artist and comics writer from Little Pine First Nations in Saskatchewan, although I've been living here for about 10 years now. I've contributed to several Cloudscape anthologies, Megafauna, Bones of the Coast, and I co-edited the anthology Life Finds a Way, which is about hopeful post-apocalyptic stories, which came out just before the COVID pandemic. So we didn't actually get a book launch because it was too post-apocalyptic to have a book launch party for it, which was a fun irony. I've also been involved with several other anthologies through Iron Circus Comics, and as a writer, I've contributed to several short story anthologies, most of them dealing with Indigenous themes of living in a modern world, but having traditional practices sort of woven into your life. This one was a departure for me and a really welcome one. It was lovely to work on this project.
All right, thanks, Alina. So the opening of the Through the Labyrinth of the Mind includes myself go into detail of what sort of inspired me to start this project, but I thought I'm gonna kind of give you kind of a quick summary here. So, funnily enough, it actually came from watching an animated superhero movie, which I guess is perhaps a fairly appropriate thing for doing something about comics. There was a movie that came out a while back called Justice League versus the Fatal Five. It was sort of a DC Comics animated movie. And basically, the premise is 5 supervillains, the Fatal Five, from 1,000 years in the future, come back to the 21st century to stop the super team, their nemesis, the Legion of Superheroes, from ever existing. And one of the Legion is able to follow them back, a superhero named Starboy. And then he has to deal with the fact that he suffers from schizophrenia, which is a very easily treatable condition in the 31st century, but the 21st century doesn't do as good a job with it. So he runs out of his medication. He starts hallucinating. Batman just shows up, beats him up, and throws him into the criminally insane lunatic asylum because he's just a guy suffering from mental health issues with superpowers in a super costume. So that's just what Batman does. And he's only able to pull himself together with the aid of Jessica Cruz, a Green Lantern superhero who suffers from crippling anxiety. And she's the only one who's able to reach him and understand him, and they work together to fight the supervillains. And I found that a very powerful idea, especially because, I mean, as the creator of the movie said, mental health issues do not have a very positive portrayal in comics, especially superhero comics. The most prominent role is the fact that most of Batman's enemies are supposedly criminally insane, so they get sent to a hospital rather than a prison, but they're also generally treated as being bad people. I mean, Joker is often written as being the most evil villain of the DC universe, despite the fact that he's, at least in theory, mentally ill. So
they're also portrayed as untreatable, as in they'll always be this evil and bad.
Yeah, that's very true. You just have to lock them up and remove them from society. Yep. So the movie was about trying to show them as heroic, as sympathetic, and I felt that to be very powerful. I felt listened in a way that I didn't suffer from the specific mental health issues of the characters in the movie. In my case, it's more a mixture of depression, anxiety, and social anxiety, but I still, in a general sense, felt heard when seeing that in a way that I hadn't before, especially the premise that not only are the heroic people with mental health issues, but in some ways the best people to reach out to them are other people who have suffered in similar ways and are trying to make sense of a world that fundamentally does not make sense for them. And so I found it to be a very powerful, transformative moment, and it made me want to create art in that particular direction. And I kind of thought back, and that it realized quite a large amount of my favorite graphic novels are about people dealing with mental health issues, even though I didn't think of them that way at the time. Alison Bechdel's groundbreaking memoir, Fun Home, spends a lot of time dealing with her, talk about her obsessive compulsive behavior, the different rituals she develops to try to make sense of herself. David B's memoir, Epileptic, is about him dealing with his brother's epilepsy and how that him trying to cope with that growing up makes him develop his own particular anxiety issues. Or even fiction, or even superhero stuff like Grant Morrison, Richard Case's Doom Patrol, Jim Starlin's Warlock. They're about superheroes with crippling depression in some ways that is a bigger problem for them than in some ways the supervillains they end up fighting. And so I found that to be very powerful. I want to do something with it. I want to do a comic with that, something with comics. So I approached Hannah about seeing if Cloudscape would be interested in engaging with that particular idea. And I was excited when that happened. I was I felt it was very important for the book to really show how it affects different kinds of people in different ways. It mattered a lot to us to have a wide range of genders, ethnicities, different kinds of mental health issues. We wanted to show it as diverse as possible. We were excited by also the kinds of stories. They're very diverse. We have memoirs. We have naturalistic memoir stories. We also have ones that are much more sort of symbolic, using kind of metaphors and symbolic imagery to describe the mental health issues. We have sort of slice of life dramas. We've got fantasy, science fiction, whichever genre makes the most sense to people. We have issues dealing with depression, anxiety, social anxiety, dementia, OCD. And I think that is something that ended up being very, very powerful about that. I think it's important to tell these kinds of stories. It's important. I mean, when I watched Justice League versus the Fatal Five, I felt this moment of kinship. I did not feel alone and isolated with my issues in the same way. And that was incredibly empowering for me, to bring closer to kind of that community, to feel like there's people that could understand, that it's okay to sort of be dealing with these issues. It's easy to feel like you're the only one suffering from them. And I think it's maybe also important for people to know they're not alone, that there's other people sort of, but also if you don't suffer from the issues, it's important to know that what it's like for other people, because if you don't suffer from mental health issues, then you definitely kind of know probably people that do. And so I think that sort of empathy is important. So I was wondering what you guys think, because you don't anything you want to add to sort of the importance of mental health stories?
Well, I can talk a little bit about where I was at when you approached me. So I had gone through the art school machine and basically been suffering from undiagnosed depression the entire time. And also my interest in comics really started with autobio work or biographical work, people being like really honest about their personal struggles in comics, like Joe Matt, really sort of a more emotional kind of work, like Chris Ware's work. And so I always wanted to make something like that. Then because of my mental health issues, I thought that would be such a great place to start, because I didn't see a lot of that stuff out in the comics world. And when I started joining Cloudscape, when I started joining their weekly meetings, it really helped me a lot with making new friends and having people to bounce ideas off of. And it really helped me through a lot of the more difficult times in my life. And so when Bevan approached me, it was like just the right time, because I had a lot of confidence. I was working on the Cloudscape board as a volunteer. I think I was vice president at that time. And it was just, it was perfect timing, because I was super excited about the idea of telling my own story, and then the idea of having a bunch of other people also telling their stories in the project. I was so jazzed and really excited when you asked me. I was like, yes, we got to do it. I was like, yes, we got to do it. We're going to do it. So that's kind of how it started. And we started reaching out to people that we knew personally, mostly first, because it's a bit awkward to like have start asking random people if they want to talk about their mental health issues in a comic. And so, one of the artists we reached out to was Alina.
Yeah, it was actually a very good timing for you to reach out to us too, because it was mid-pandemic. So after lockdowns, but as people were trying to sort of function in society again and everything was really changed, it was a period of really high stress for a lot of people, but especially for somebody who deals with OCD like I do. So I have OCD and generalized anxiety, and some of my OCD triggers are germs and the idea that death is all around you at all times, which really made COVID a treat to live through. That was a lot of fun. So I was already been thinking about mental health issues quite a lot in dealing with the sort of fallout from that. And so it was a very, very good time to be approached and be like, hey, do you want to tell a story about living with OCD? And I realized, thinking about it, that a lot of the media I'd seen where OCD is represented at all, it's very misrepresented. So it tends to be mostly just obsession with keeping things neat and angled or hand washing an excessive amount. And very little goes into the actual mental triggers behind the obsessive compulsive disorder. So in my story, I made sure I wanted to have like most of a page that was just a chart of the OCD wheel of like the building anxiety, the need to do one of the obsessive behaviors to ameliorate the anxiety, and then the sense of relief after you've done the behavior that then swings back into the anxiety arc in this never-ending spiral. So I decided to go less metaphorical with my story and more just, this is what it's like to live with OCD, and it might not be the same for everyone, but at least this is a representation of what it's like. That's more accurate than anything I'd seen before.
Yeah, definitely, I think results in a very effective story. As I mentioned, I think there's a lot of books, like comic books, that either directly or indirectly relate to mental health, from memoirs that go into really in depth to superhero stories that sort of play around with some imagery of that for your characters. So I was wondering, do you guys think is there something about the comics medium that makes it especially effective for telling stories about mental health issues, or which encourage that particular kind of story?
You want to go ahead, Alina?
Sure. I mean, I love comics as a medium because they're really accessible to a wide variety of people. Especially younger readers tend to really be drawn into the artwork. Even if they're not strong readers, they can engage with the artwork. But even if they are more advanced readers, like, it's still a really interesting way to, you might imagine a scene one way in your head, but when it's on the comic page, you can read into it in a very different way than if it was just in text. So I think it's a very engaging medium to talk about something that a lot of people might be very scared to talk about or to investigate further.
That's a really good point, actually. The idea that, like, you can sort of project your own experiences onto the images as you're reading it and feel. I've had a lot of people tell me that they have felt like they could really relate to my story, which is really interesting to me, just because of how personal it felt at the time. And people telling me, like, I know that feeling, like, by looking at the images. And I think, like, imagery is such a powerful tool for expressing emotions, that comics is perfect for sort of explaining things in a way that is more ambiguous and relatable.
Yeah, I think it's very true. I think pictures can be very intimate. I mean, it takes millions of years to evolve, but we've only really had books for like a few thousand. So, like, our brains, we have to force our brains to read. That's not how we naturally understand stories of the world. We understand through pictures, through sounds, and so I think in some ways that makes it easier to engage with pictures, with a story with pictures, and where you more quickly, more deeply get into it, which I think is very powerful. But like a book, comics are kind of intimate. You're not sharing it with someone, the reading with someone else in the same way as you're often watching a movie with more than one person. So I think maybe that also helps to kind of go deep into the person's head, kind of explore sort of what they're thinking.
I think you might have something there about the relatability of the images that are depicted, that are a little bit less, like, when you watch a movie, you're seeing the actor and you don't necessarily relate to that actor in the same way as you do with a little cartoon person on a page, where you're filling in who they are, and you can relate to them a lot easier, which I think is why superhero comics are really appealing to a lot of younger people, who are sort of see themselves in these larger than life characters.
I think another interesting thing about it is words and pictures can do different things on the same panel, and like I think there's like a tradition of having very metaphorical imagery in like even memoirs, like in Mouse, where everyone looks like animal, like mice and cats and stuff like that, or in Epileptic, where it becomes really monstrous and kind of a lot of horror imagery, like sort of anxiety and epilepsy turning into dragons and demons and stuff. They're attacking the characters. But then the captions are very naturalistic. So like the words are telling you what's actually happening. Literally, the pictures are showing a more metaphorical, emotional, often exploration of it. And so
or you can get irony, where you go, everything was fine, but in the image on the page, everything is very much not fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of the magic that happens in comics is the juxtaposition of the text versus the imagery. And it's sort of like the text shouldn't describe what is in the panel. It should complement it or like oppose it.
Yeah, and metaphors are a really great way to engage with these sort of mental health issues, because a lot of time they're often hard to put into words. But if you can draw some of the feeling and then support that with text, it makes it easier to express.
Yeah, definitely. So I thought maybe so let's now move to talk more specifically about our own particular stories there. So I kind of decided to sort of engage with sort of my own kind of cultural heritage. I'm really into King Arthur stories. I'm of Welsh heritage, so that's sort of the original version of the King Arthur stories. And I became fascinated with the fact that like a lot of people kind of who haven't really read them kind of imagine the characters being very two-dimensional, sort of pure good, virtuous knights. But they're often incredibly flawed. Like the theme is often not so much that you should be good like these. It's that you should aspire towards goodness, even though you fail, even though people fail because they are imperfect, because they are mortal. And many of them fail psychologically. Like one of the Welsh romances is about a knight called Geraint, whose father gets too old to run his own kingdom, so Geraint has to run it, and he just wants to be a knight and an explorer. That's where he gets his bliss. And he falls into depression because he has to be a king, and he feels trapped. And he thinks no one can love him. And when he sees his wife crying, he assumes that she must have a lover, an affair, because he does not believe that she could feel so compassionate for him because he's hating himself. And so he rides off into the forest to die, to fight as many giants and knights as possible because he feels that's the only thing left for him. And it feels very real. I was fascinated this medieval story written by my ancestors felt so psychologically real and so related to modern issues of feeling trapped and frustrated. This is not the life you want, and you don't know how to escape it. And so I wanted to explore that, to kind of to feel this kinship I felt with my ancestors exploring similar issues, and maybe to feel kind of this connection between the present and the past in my story. So I work with Devin Rosiczuck, a very compelling, detailed artist, to sort of boil it down to like a 9-page story. And I felt that to be a very powerful and personal experience. How about you guys?
Yeah, I think what I'm one of the things I'm most proud of in this book is how many different approaches people took to creating their own story. So like Bevan decided to do the story about the knight's tale he just mentioned, and then I decided to do something a little bit more autobiographical, but still had a sort of like a surreal fantasy element. So my story is basically exactly what I mentioned right at the beginning, is I basically had undiagnosed depression throughout my art school career, and so I talk about the feeling of, I was trying to express what depression feels like through imagery. And so I felt oftentimes like it was a black cloud around. I think there's a lot of brain fog that comes with depression, but also oftentimes I would be comforted by it, like feeling alone and wanting to be alone and kind of like wallowing in self-pity, and then it becoming a bit of a cycle. So my story is sort of about that journey and coming to terms with that and eventually seeking professional help, and then making friends at Cloudscape and expressing how important it is to me to like talk about these things. At the end of my story, I talk about how important it is to be open, in my opinion, about your mental health issues, just because you never know who you're going to inspire or affect. You can make lots of really good connections through just being honest about your struggles. Alina?
Cool. And then with my story, I set out, like I said before, with the goal of educating about what it's like living with OCD. So I knew I was going to do a really straightforward biographical comic. And as I was going through and remembering sort of like, what are key moments in my life where OCD really affected me? And I realized it went back all the way to childhood. Like I have memories, like I say in the story, of walking home from kindergarten and having to step on a certain stone on the way home from school, or something bad would happen, which I didn't realize at the time was compulsion. And my friends making fun of me for it, you know, a weird little 6-year-old wandering halfway across a field and then in another direction every day was very unusual. Again, there's stories from high school where it really affected my life. One that didn't make it into the book was I had gotten a role in a high school play in grade 11 and went out for rehearsals every week. We were getting close to the play happening, and then there was one day when I had a very bad anxiety attack and wasn't able to come to the dress rehearsal and ended up losing my role to the understudy because of it. And at the time, I hadn't talked to anyone about it, and I was just starting to kind of realize I probably needed counseling and maybe some medication to help me deal with my anxiety. And when I told my theater instructor about it, he broke down crying because his daughter had just been diagnosed with OCD as well. And he was like, I wish you'd told me. I could have made some kind of accommodation for you. But, you know, as it was, you missed too many rehearsals. So we had to switch you out. And but yeah, he was the first adult I remember really speaking with me about OCD and really being clear on what it was, because I didn't have words for it then. And he was able to, after I described it to him, say, oh yeah, I know what that is. My daughter has that. So I wish I could have packed that in here, but I already had a lot to talk about. Just describing what it's like living with OCD.
That's interesting that you say that, like how impactful that was to you to have an adult validate your feelings, because I think I probably suffered with depression. I mean, I didn't realize till I'd gotten into counseling that it probably started when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And I just thought oftentimes that if I was feeling bad or unmotivated, it was because I was lazy, and I would beat myself up about it. And eventually it just kind of like spiraled to a very ugly, bad place. And so I think that is another sort of like testament to like talking about it and like helping it.
Were you encouraged to hide those feelings?
I mean,
to pretend to be normal.
I think like when I was a teen, I was like emo and depressed and going through a phase. And then I was a, tortured art student. And for a while that was kind of cool. But then when you're shot out into the real world and like having to try and find a way to like make money off of an art school education, you really are like alone. And because of the depression, I was really shy throughout school. I was afraid of talking to people and making friends, which made it even worse when I was out of school because I was alone and didn't have anyone to bounce ideas off of. So yeah, I think like if I had met people who were talking openly about their mental health, it would have made such a huge difference earlier. For me.
Yeah. I mean, I think the theme of them talking about is something that shows up over and over in our anthology, and you mentioned in yours, and like a big plot element. The Geraint story that I adapted is that Geraint refuses to talk about his issues. He feels he's supposed to be the good knight, the good king, the good son, and if he feels to be emasculating to even trust his wife with his anxiety, and so he becomes more and more problematic and even sort of verbally abusive to her, and she has no idea what's going on and why he's just riding off to sort of to his doom. And the story ends with him finally breaking down and confessing, and that's sort of how he's able to deal with who he is.
Yeah, I feel like there is a pressure for people with mental health issues, especially in previous generations. It's changing now, but to try and hide their issues, especially with things like OCD, where you have tics or certain behaviors that you perform that sort of mark you as weird. And it's something that I've dealt with over the past couple decades, because obviously being queer, being non-binary, and also having a mental health issues, there was like many aspects of my life that I felt I needed to hide from the general public. And so being an adult has been a process of sort of learning that I can be myself and that people just need to put up with it.
Yeah. I think that is a thing with depression all the time. You see people who like say like, oh, we didn't know they were depressed. They seem so happy. And I remember, I think just shortly before we were talking about this, I was invited to my friend's birthday party. And we were both talking about how like we both knew each other like struggled with anxiety and depression, and I made a joke about how hard it was for me to leave the house, and she made a joke about how hard it was for her to leave the house for her own birthday, and we were like, isn't it so funny, we're here and pretending to have such a good time and we're both so miserable. And like I felt better after having that conversation, but it's like kind of eye-opening, like how, you know, like you're not supposed to talk about how sad you are or how unmotivated you are. So yeah. And
being able to talk about it with your friends and be like, you know what, I don't think I'm gonna be able to make that plan today. It's not a good brain day for me. I'm just gonna be at home today. Is kind of liberating.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think the reason why Just Leave for This Fatal Five was such a grand move for me in some ways, I didn't realize that it hadn't been talked about until I actually saw it being talked about. I didn't realize that was a part of myself that wasn't really discussed in popular culture until I actually saw it very explicitly discussed in popular culture.
Yeah, so this is a great way for people to be visible.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we're definitely sort of talking about sort of how I guess transformative the process is for us to write and draw about this, to even just sort of talk about it. And I think maybe an important part of for me of creating this book is just to encourage other people to kind of explore their own issues, either through comics or through whatever kind of artistic medium is viable for them. And I was just thinking, in some ways, I think like what advice I would give for that. And I think maybe, and one thing that maybe it's anything difficult is that I think honesty and kind of truth, I think, is the really important thing, and that can take different forms. Like I think when talking about stories, I think we can talk about literal truth, and we can talk about emotional truth. That certain things can more easily capture a feeling than simply describing how it's actually happening. I'm blanking the author's name. He was a guy who's in Vietnam, and he wrote autobiographies of his own experience. And he also wrote a novel, Things They Carry. And I felt it was interesting he did both. And he said one of the reasons for the novel, he felt that was an easier way to capture what it felt like to be in Vietnam. And in fact, at various times, the narrator who's based on him will say something and will even confess that, well, it didn't actually quite happen. Like, we didn't find that body in that particular way, or my fellow soldier did not die in that particular way, but I felt that would best capture what it feels like when he died. And I felt that to be very compelling. And I think that is one of the reasons, we have care. I told sort of a cultural myth. We have another person who described it as sort of a role-playing video game. She was playing, and that was sort of capturing sort of her issues. We have a lot of very, both of you described your issues in kind of a metaphorical, almost as this living supernatural entity you're in direct interaction with. And I think that's important to find out what is the best way, what makes the feelings real to you, and then to be very honest about that, and be willing to deal with it when it's uncomfortable, to try to put your discomfort and your rawness kind of on the page in the way that's sort of best for you. What do you guys think? What would be the most important thing when telling these sorts of stories?
I think for this book in particular, what stood out to me was the use of metaphor and symbolism. Like even the more autobiographical works have like pretty strong and powerful symbols, and that's something that we decided to incorporate into the book design. So at the beginning of each story, we've picked a symbol. Like for Alina's, it was a little like statue of a brain gremlin that is their little OCD brain gremlins, and Bevan's was a chess piece.
A white knight kind of fallen over.
Yeah, and we have my friend Eden's story has a candle. And so actually Eden's story is one of my favorites in the book, and it's because she's chosen to represent her experience with PTSD as a cancer survivor, as basic, like a fantasy, like a dark fantasy of a girl living in a sort of corrupted, haunted house, and her saying, there's all these things wrong in this house. I need help here, and the sort of town wizard coming by saying, no, everything's fine, everything looks good, it's fine. But then as soon as the wizard leaves, there's the paranoia that creeps in of things are not right here. And, I think that's such an interesting metaphor for her feelings.
That's one of the ones where I really love the irony on the page of going, everything's fine, and then the room is like dark and creepy, and there's these tendrils like creeping in.
But yeah, and like how Kelly Chen chose to illustrate her experience with mental health as a video game, and going through different battles and traveling across strange lands.
Oh, if only we got XP every time we find a mental health battle.
Yeah.
It would be so powerful.
And then Carla Monterosa, who spoke about anxiety. I think anxiety is really common amongst artists, but Carla's approach is sort of more about her anxiety being an immigrant and being away from her family and feeling pressure to work to send money home to her family, and also sort of the feelings of anxiety about potentially being sent back home after her visa runs out. So there's so many things to be anxious about. And there's so many, like such a wide variety of expressions of
different styles too. Every single style has is so radically different than the one before. I love it.
Like Jack Briglio and Devin Taylor's work about his father's or grandfather's sort of decline into dementia. It still comes down to a symbol of a chocolate bar. But it's also like very illustrated in a very beautiful traditional comic book way.
Yeah, very, very realistic kind of, which I think really captures the very slice of life, kind of very grounded story. It's much less symbolic, so it kind of
I like how every single one of the stories is different, but they are all humanizing and relatable.
Mhm.
Even the most metaphorical ones in there have, I don't have anything in common with a Welsh king, but reading a story about a man with depression is relatable and humanizing. Like you can sort of feel like these are people you could meet on the street, even if they're living in fantasy realms or living in the distant past. And I think that's really going to make stories of mental health a lot more approachable for people to engage with.
Yeah. So as you said, like people who want to write their own stories, I think it's important to like think about your story thoroughly, decide like what you want to tell, and then I think it's really powerful to incorporate symbolism or metaphor as a sort of vehicle to telling that story.
Yeah. Very true. Oh, and Patrick O'Brien was the Vietnam War veteran I was thinking of.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I should read those books. I've read all of the ship ones.
Wait, or maybe it's someone else, right?
Maybe?
Patrick O'Brien.
He did lots of tall ships.
It's not.
Napoleonic era battles.
All right, yeah.
Huh.
Maybe I'm thinking of someone else, but anyways, maybe Kevin O'Brien. Anyways, doesn't. Anyways,
Some O'Brien.
Something like that.
We will Google it later.
Anyways, so we thought we might take the opportunity to take any questions now. Does anybody have any questions or comments about what we've been discussing? Yeah.
Well, congratulations on getting completed that. It's everyone involved. I think it's courageous work. I think we are in an era where there's a lot more understanding, but any kind of mental health challenge can be a distance. So I think it's a noble gesture on the part of everyone involved. One thing I was thinking about when you're talking about these matters is the actual production of comic books. I find at times can be challenging to your mental health. I know, you can be 12, 14 hours in isolation.
Yeah.
That's alone with your mind. So I know even I have to be conscious of these things. There's kind of like a timer now in terms of how long I'm going to be at the desk. So I was curious, respectively, how all of you have faced that particular challenges in the production of comics. Or if it's been an issue in any way.
At least for me, like that's what my story was about, was being really isolated after leaving art school and trying to create work without anyone to talk to about it. And so like it was Cloudscape, really the publisher and community comics organization that brought me out of it. So they have, I don't know, the pandemic kind of like messed up their schedule with they used to have weekly meetings. I'm not sure if they're still weekly or if they're bi-weekly, but they're either online or in person now, and you can go and work with a bunch of other local comic artists and get feedback on your work. And that was huge for me. I made a bunch of new friends and felt really validated, and it led essentially to the creation of this book. But yeah, it was super important for me to like meet other people who are also working on art and having people to communicate with, because it's incredibly isolating, and you start to panic about, is this good enough, or is it terrible, or am I terrible? And it's so very important to me, at least. How about you, Bevan?
Well, so for the process of writing or doing sustained activities, I often find that I think is maybe related to my anxiety, difficult to focus on it, because it's hard for me to focus more than one thing at a time, and writing has a lot of moving parts. So I think one thing that helps with comics is I find, because it's easier to place different parts of the story in different parts of the page, like you're just dialogue versus description versus this arc of the story. I found that being able to do that is maybe much easier for me to focus on it. Like I'll often initially just write a comic as almost like a movie script, where I'm not really describing what's happening in each panel. I'm just putting on the dialogue and summary of actions, and then I'll go over it a second time, and that's when I add the description. And I find being able to compartmentalize the parts that I'm trying to do makes it easier for me to stay focused on writing, and maybe feel less anxious about all the different parts of it.
So cons of doing comics: you lock yourself away for a long time, and then you produce a thing that you won't see anyone read, so you don't know how it's released online, which is an anxiety all of its own. It doesn't pay super well, so you're anxious about money a lot of the time. But one of the pros of it that I really like is, other than like the passion of creating it, which kind of sustains me, is I was finding that a lot of the stuff I've been writing post-COVID is all processing a lot of the trauma that we went through when we were in lockdown and isolation. And writing it out on the page and then drawing it is a safe way to sort of process some of the memories of being that alone, or going, oh, actually, that's going to recontextualize that day for me. And I was like, oh, I was actually, this was what was bothering me, not being alone. It was that feeling of, the world no longer being safe was driving the isolation. So it's a fun way to engage with the work in a really deliberate way when you're writing a comic script, in a way that is different than writing a novel, because you have so few words to work with. And so the images that you pick to pair with those words do a lot more heavy lifting. And I find that really an interesting mental exercise.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. I just have a question about when you're writing your script. Do you do your own illustrations, or do you have an artist that works? You choose an artist to help you illustrate, or do you do both?
It's a variety. It depends.
Yeah, it depends on the project.
Yeah, and so for this book specifically, I wrote and illustrated my story. Alina as well, and then Bevan wrote his, and then had another artist come in to illustrate it.
Follow up for that. So if you have another artist, how do you describe what you would like to see visually?
How did you do that, Bevan?
Well, I mean, so I think an interesting thing about comics, as opposed to, say, movies or TV with regards to the scripts, is there isn't a regimented way of this is how it's supposed to look. With movies or TV, there is, both because it has to be shown to numerous people, but also because each page of the script needs to be a minute of time. And so if you describe what's going on too much on a page, then you're messing with sort of the way that's recording how long the movie is going to be. And comics don't do that. They just label, this is page 1, this is page 2. So it's really more of a conversation between the writer and the artist. And so with some artists, I go into more detail. Other ones, I don't. Some artists are more experienced and like to contribute more creatively to what each scene looks like. Other ones either don't like that as much, or they're not experienced, I don't trust them as much to really choose the most visually compelling moment. And so then I go into more detail. So that really depends.
For something that was personal like this one, did you describe more than you would in a project that was less tied to you?
Yeah, I think so. It's more personal. It's also kind of a fantasy environment. And so you have to give a better sense of what everyone looks like. If it's just the modern world, there's often less that needs to be described in that particular sense.
There is no formula for script writing for comics. And actually, if you have a chance to look up Alan Moore's script writing for comics, it's wild. It's like all caps and chunks and very hard to decipher. So I think as an artist, I would be horrified to receive something like that. So I mean, I think I appreciate, like, when I write a script for myself, I usually write it so it's like kind of like a movie script, but I give myself little hints of like what I want the frame to look like a close-up of someone's face, or a wide box of a drawing of an outdoor space. So that can be helpful, like if you have a vision in your mind for how it would look, but also like I'm sure the artist would love to interpret.
I
do their thing
when I'm writing scripts for somebody else. There'll be panels that I don't really care what they look like, and I'll describe just like a 3/4 view of the person's face with heavy shadows on it. And then there are others that are really important to the story to look a certain way, and those I'll really describe well, and in some cases even thumbnail, just to make sure that like this is what I had pictured for this reason. But most of the time, I'm not super tied to what the panel's going to look like, and I'll go, here's a rough description. I'm trusting you, the artist, to come up with something cool.
Any other questions? Yep.
I'm sort of curious about the process of writing. I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are on, mental health is such a tough subject, and so depending on what condition you're talking about as well, it can have kind of implications for your like family even, or people around you. And I'm curious, like, what you think about kind of like the ethics of like including people in your life in the stories. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no clear answer to that. I think a lot of those things are sort of done on a case by case basis. You have to kind of weigh different things, sort of the honesty of your story versus, I mean, certainly there's people that can be problematic to other people. I mean, the first volume, Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, is about her complicated relationship with her dead father, and a lot of sort of the bad things that her father did. Her second volume is about her complicated relationship with her mother, which starts with a lot of conversations with her mother, who's not pleased by how the family looks in the first volume. I mean, I think perhaps in the best case, if it's viable, talking to the people ahead of time. I mean, that actually comes up in Are You My Mother, where the mother finally shrugs and says, I don't really approve of you saying this, but go ahead if you feel like you need to do it. She's at least willing to live with sort of the honesty of the book. And I think if it's possible to at least get that from the people you're exploring, then that's good. If not, you've got to decide what's more important. Or you can also have metaphorical people that symbolically represent the people that you have issues with. That can be
so fraught, and that's such a fraught conversation to have, especially when you get into family stuff. I'm writing a novel right now that is a slightly fictionalized look at my family's intergenerational trauma and post-residential school experiences, which is a lot. And I had to sit down with my family and be like, so I'm writing this, and it's very much informed by us. These characters aren't us, but they kind of are. And my mom was like, that's great. I'm totally happy to have you write me and your sister in it, but your grandma is going to be really angry. And I'm like, I know, it's not her, though. It's a version of her. And she's like, yeah, but like, just be aware. I'm like, okay, but like, I can't not talk about that because it informs the trauma of all of the other characters in this story. So I'm just going to have a chat with my grandma. It'll be fine.
Yeah, I think at least for me, it's like you have to come up with a strong story first, and then decide like if the characters that are a part of it, like if it's important for them to be like accurate representations of your friends or family. Like when I wrote my story, I was actually living with my boyfriend at the time, and I completely omitted him from the story because he was not helpful during that time for me at all, and I just felt like it was irrelevant to my arc in the story. But if you feel like you have someone that it's important to a part of the story, I think what they're saying is to talk to them first. I would highly recommend that. I think that's important. And that's my advice, is to talk to them ahead of time. Surprise is like the worst.
Don't do that.
There's an episode of a TV show too with Mark Maron. What was that show called? Mark Maron stars in one of the episodes as a comic artist who gets in trouble for representing like relationship. I think it's a pretty common thing for a lot of these sort of like straight white male guys who did autobio stuff is they represent people in their lives without asking permission or even talking to them. And then,
especially in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, and then having to deal with the fallout of all these
Yeah.
people who aren't happy with how they've been portrayed or aren't happy being portrayed at all. And so, like, if you care about these people,
Some
I
of
think
which
that's pretty
is-
important
yeah.
to clear up with them, like how they feel about it. Yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes left. Does someone else have another question?
No.
Okay. Well, I mean, there actually was something else that I was, I guess. So I kind of mentioned some of the source, definitely stuff that inspired me. The Fatal Five movie, sorry, and then sort of comics like Epileptic, Fun Home as sort of powerful stories for mental health. Even in my case, the Legion and Doom Patrol TV shows, I think, are probably the best superhero TV shows out there and are surprisingly compelling looks at mental health issues in different ways. I was wondering if either of you have sort of graphic novels that you would especially kind of recommend for exploring mental health, either ones that directly inspired you or just the ones you found useful.
Mine's not a graphic novel, but if you do want to read more about what it's like to live with OCD, I highly recommend Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. I really, really related to that one, even though the main character's version of OCD and her OCD triggers are a lot different than mine. There was enough same in there for me to be like, oh yeah, that's what that's like. And it's just a really, really good representation for it.
For me, at least, I think some of the best visual representations of mental health that I've seen have been at like zine fairs.
Oh yeah, yes.
There's so many
Yes.
local independent artists who have their own struggles and love to write about them. And so actually there's a bunch of booths upstairs, and I definitely saw some content on mental health up there. So that I've got a little collection of a number of zines. Every time I see one about mental health, I usually pick one up.
There was a couple good zines on mental health at VanCap this spring, and I
I'm
can't remember the artist.
Yeah, that's the thing, is I've got like a collection of probably like 15
same.
mental health, and I can't remember any of them.
Yeah, definitely VanCat, Vancouver Comics Art Festival is a great source for stuff about that.
Inspiring content.
Actually,
and it's free.
Yeah.
One of the big graphic novels that actually probably inspired this book was Elaine M. Will's Look Straight Ahead, which is a very powerful symbolic story of a teenager suffering from a mental breakdown, and then it's shown as monsters and demons and fighting against stuff. And actually, she contributed a story to this particular book, so that was pretty exciting. Okay, so it looks like we're pretty much out of time. So I'd just like to remind you, if you are interested in the Labyrinths of the Mind, it is available on the table right over there with various other books being sold by various attendees here. Cloudscape Comics, the publisher of this and of numerous independent comics, also has a booth upstairs in the rotunda. So definitely take a look at the various things they have there. And thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of Word Vancouver.